welcome to another episode of History Bites. My name is Lacey Villava, and I am Gunston Hall's Education Manager and the moderator for our May program. Viewers may remember that we're on the third of three programs on freedom of the press. Back in March, we kicked it off with Dr. Sam Lebovic of George Mason University, who laid out the historic framework of freedom of the press for us. Last month, we brought on our conversation forward in time with Brianna Erickson of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker on modern freedom of the press violations and challenges. This month, we're exploring how student journalists engage with this right. I am super excited to sit down with Myesha Phukan. Myesha is a current freshman at UC Berkeley, just wrapped up. So technically now I think you're a sophomore, and is majoring in legal studies with a minor in journalism and a reporter for the Daily Californian. She serves as an advocacy intern for the Student Press Law Center, and Myesha works to protect the rights of student journalists nationally through policy change. Previously, she served as the editor-in-chief of her high school newspaper, The Oracle, where she experienced administrative censorship, an experience that propelled her passion for student press freedom. She was the winner of SPLC's 2024 Courage in Student Journalism Award and hopes to continue working to protect student journalists across the country. Thanks for joining us today, Myesha.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. Viewers, if you have any questions at any time during the program, please drop them into the chat here on YouTube Live. I'm also keeping an eye out on our historic@gunstonhall.org email account, and I'll share them with Myesha as we get a little further along in the program. So, Myesha, could you introduce the SPLC and the work you do there, please?
Yes, for sure. So let me just share my slides real quick. Um, The SPLC is essentially a nonprofit organization that works to support and defend the rights of student journalists and also student media advisors. They've been around for quite some time now, and we're a pretty small team around, I would say 9 people regularly, and we have interns like myself coming and going, but it's a super cool organization. They have a lot of different resources for student journalists and advisors. I was first introduced to the SPLC when I was undergoing my own kind of censorship experience during my sophomore year of high school, which I'll touch on um, a bit later. But the way I got involved at first was we had submitted a request through their free legal hotline, which you can find on their website. Essentially, this is one of like the many resources they have where you can just, if you have any concerns regarding censorship or any possible scenario like that, you can submit a request for them to review the situation, review an article at hand, things like that, and they'll help. And so that's how I first kind of got involved with the SPLC, not as an intern, but as a journalist looking for help and with their further assistance. And from then, I got more involved with the organization. I was super kind of passionate about what it was advocating for, especially having gone through my own censorship experience. And this was like the first time I'd been introduced to an organization that's purpose was solely to help student journalists, rather than like professional media or the First Amendment as like a larger entity. But I started writing op-eds for their blog, and then also I started. They have like a summer institute. I got involved in that. But long story short, I started interning there as an advocacy intern in October of last year. I've continued it, will be continuing it through the summer, but essentially I work under the New Voices kind of category. New Voices, which I will also go into further, is basically a movement that seeks to produce stronger student press protection legislation in all of the 50 states. What it does is it basically returns student press protection laws back to the Tinker standard, which was the result of the Tinker v. Des Moines Supreme Court case. That was essentially a big win for student journalists and gave them more rights and more protections in terms of what administrators could and could not censor. This was later overturned by the Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer case. I believe in the late, I want to say like 1990s, not exactly sure. But that essentially made it easier for administrators to arbitrarily censor student media. And so a lot of states today still operate on the Hazelwood standard, and are very restrictive in terms of what student journalists can cover without fear of retaliation or censorship. And so the whole movement essentially seeks to revert back to the Tinker Standard to give student journalists and media advisors more protections against violations of freedom of the press rights. So I essentially serve as an intern under that wing. The work I do has a lot to do with advocacy, and also this past spring was legislative season for a lot of different states. So a lot of what I was doing was working on kind of like reaching out to students, looking at watching hearings on different bills, writing up blog posts. And then something really important that the SPLC also does is kind of track district media policies. So while a lot of these states do have an overarching kind of state law that adheres to the Tinker Standard, a lot of school districts sometimes don't implement a policy that's compliant with that. And so a lot of my work also has to do with researching district policy compliance, and looking at if that meets matches the state law and if it's compliant, and then if not, sending freedom of information requests and kind of communicating with school boards and superintendents to kind of edit their media policies. And so that's a bit of the work I do. The SPLC also, as a larger organization, has a lot of different resources. I mentioned the legal hotline. We have a legal team that's specifically dedicated to like looking at these matters and talking to student journalists free of charge. There's also a bunch of different things like model district press policies, model FOI requests, resources for student journalists, and also um, like a law library, if that makes sense, of a bunch of different laws and policies relating to student journalism, either federally or state and district level. And those are only a couple of the bunch of resources they have, but those are some of the things that I found most helpful when I was going through my own censorship experience. But yeah, working with them has really been amazing. I feel like it's really full circle for me to come from going to them for help to now being able to work with them to kind of provide that same help to other student journalists. And I think it's just a really important organization that is very unique in what it does. And it's truly everyone I work with is so passionate about what they're doing and very kind of has a vested interest in wanting to protect the rights of student journalists across the country. So it's been a great experience so far.
I mentioned in your introduction, and you referred to it a couple of times in responding to this last question, Myesha, you had a very personal experience with freedom of the press violations. Can you tell us what that was like for you and how it really affects your work today?
Yes, of course. So, bear with me. It's a little bit long-winded, but I'll try my best to keep it kind of short. This is kind of a brief overview of the timeline of what happened. So, this happened in my sophomore year of high school. I'm a freshman in college now, so this was about 3 years ago. Essentially, my high school newspaper had a section where we would do investigative long-form articles. They would be around 3,000 words, really going in depth on a certain topic. And so that this particular cycle in question, my co-editor and I had heard kind of a lot of rumblings and stories of um, a lot of our friends and just like students in general being dissatisfied with the way that our school was handling sexual harassment cases, in terms of either them being swept under the rug or not having sufficient punishment for the alleged perpetrators. And there was kind of multiple widespread incidents that happened where a lot of people felt like no accountability was taken. And so we decided to kind of take this and turn it into a larger, more investigative article looking at not only what happened at our school, but just the effects of sexual harassment on teenagers. We talked to lawyers, professionals, things like that. And so where things kind of start to go downhill was we emailed our principal to do an interview about our Title IX policies as a school just to figure out kind of the hierarchy of where cases are reported, where they go, things like that. And so after we had that interview, our principal basically requested a meeting with the whole class and also just the editors and writers of the article. Um, and essentially, she basically told us that the publication of this story would be catastrophic, and she essentially, like, implicitly was threatening our journalism program and spoke about how easily, she could take it away and how journalism programs were becoming increasingly rare to have at schools. And so she ended up asking for prior review, which isn't technically or legally constituted censorship. It had never happened in my school before, but that's basically when an administrator just asked to see a copy of the story before publication. And so we sent her a copy of our first draft, and she had a meeting, a closed door meeting with the writers of the article and our advisor, and she basically told us that the publication of the article, again, would have a catastrophic impact on the school. She said it would make the school look bad in terms of its perception within the community and the public. And she wanted us to essentially remove all identifying information, all descriptions of the harassment that occurred, quotes, specific stories, and kind of like things that would connect to the school itself, which anyone that's kind of involved in journalism knows you can't really have a story if you don't have quotes from sources, if you don't have, accurate descriptions of what happened. Um, and we had so much kind of evidence and interviews from a ton of different sources. And so we really had a lot of information that she wanted to kind of cut down, and she went back and forth with us. She, scratched out all the things that she wanted to be taken out and was just very threatening in that manner. Um, and then throughout this process, as I mentioned, we reached out to the SPLC's legal hotline just to make sure that our writing was legally and ethically sound. We talked to them about the caveats of naming individuals versus keeping individuals anonymous, things like that. They were very helpful. Ultimately, we published the article in, I believe, early April. We did decide to water it down heavily, which, like, now, like, working in like this kind of field, like, I realized was more of like a self-censorship mechanism because we were scared of what our principal would do if we published, the original version of the article. But we published it nonetheless. And then after shortly, about a month after the publication of our article, so this is May, my school ended in June. Our principal came into the class and basically told us that our journalism advisor was being reassigned. She had given her no prior notice, she'd given us no prior notice, and it was very coincidental with the publication of the article. And she replaced our experienced journalism advisor with the then current drama teacher at our school who had essentially no journalism experience. He was an amazing advisor my senior year, and he really was, working to protect us, but he was, thrown into this position that he had no experience with whatsoever. And so she removed our advisor, and then she basically removed our introduction to journalism class, which taught us the foundations of journalism and how to write before we wrote for the actual paper. And both of these were under essentially false pretenses. The removal of our journalism class was citing low enrollment, even though enrollment was the same as it had been for the past 2 years. She removed our advisor because she wanted to transform our journalism program into a career technical education pathway. And she said that our advisor didn't want to get these credentials, even though our advisor was actively working, our former advisor was actively working and also now has these credentials and still, was not reinstated as the leader of our journalism program. But they got a lot of media attention. So essentially, when this happened, we reached out to a lot of local media because that was our best way of advocating. As I mean, I was a sophomore, my co-editor was a freshman, and so we didn't really know what to do. But we basically spoke at board meetings. We had the community response was honestly terrific. We had parents, alumni, journalism advisors at other schools in the Bay Area, even, across states and across the country, advocating on our behalf, sending letters, coming to speak at board meetings. But it got a lot of media coverage. The picture on the bottom right is the first blog post that I ever wrote for SPLC, which is crazy. I haven't like looked at that in a while, but it's a crazy full circle moment. But got a lot of media coverage, which I think really helped our principal to kind of like stand down in that manner. And then a little bit after that, oh, this is, if anyone wants to scan the QR code, it should go to an online version of the article. But I kind of explained this earlier. It was more of a long form article and it included various accounts of harassment, including stalking, attempted rape, and then inappropriate messages and just behavior on and off campus. And so what ended up happening was I personally did not sue or file legal action, but our former advisor and then another writer of the story and then our former co-editor in chief essentially all sued our principal and the board, I believe the school board in February of 2024, citing violations of California Education Code. I believe Ed Code 48907, which is essentially the state student media or press protection law, and then labor code in terms of, I believe, wrongful termination. I'm not too sure on that. The QR code should go to a copy of the complaint, but it might not work. Essentially, the desired outcomes of the lawsuit were the reinstatement of our intro to journalism class, the reinstatement of our former advisor, as she now does have her credentials, and then prevention of future censorship of the article, and then acknowledgement that administrators basically, did censor the article. They're currently in the process of negotiating right now. If they don't come to a settlement, the trial date is set to be in November of this year, and it they've requested a jury trial, and so it's still an ongoing issue. But yeah, that's kind of a summary of my experience. And then again, I reached out to the Student Press Law Center a lot through this process, and they were extremely helpful, which is how I kind of got involved with them.
I double checked both of the QR codes. They do work.
Perfect.
Yep. And I'm looking forward to, as you and I were chatting earlier, I am stepping in for our usual moderator, Julia, and I haven't had a chance to read the article yet. So I'm really curious to see how this is all ties together and see your original writing as well. So our last formal question today, and then we'll open it up for any questions from our audience. How did your experience as a student journalist change the way you understand the role of student media in holding schools accountable?
Yeah, for sure. I think something I've realized is that a lot of people underestimate the power of student media, whether you're referring to high school or college media. Um, College, especially college newspapers. I'm at Berkeley now, as you mentioned, but our student newspaper is a newspaper of record for the city of Berkeley, and it has been for a long time. And so student media is where a lot of not only students but community members get their news and get their information about what is happening in the community. And it's a really, I think, powerful source of media because obviously professional news organizations are amazing. I think that student journalists have a different kind of power in that we know what's going on at the school level and we're able to go a lot deeper into it because, especially in high school, we're not covering such a broader scope of things. Um, and I didn't realize how much power I think that our publication had until we wrote this article. And it was really gratifying to see the response. A lot of survivors and victims of the harassment reached out to us and were super thankful for us to about for writing this article, things like that. And as a high school newspaper, I'm obviously biased, but I think we were able to cover a lot of really difficult and tough topics that a lot of people didn't know about or wouldn't have known about without our publication. And so I think the student media just has a really unique power of being able to highlight not only, student wins and things like that, but also administrative failures, things that aren't being broadcast to the public either because people don't want them to know or they're just, not publicly available. People don't really know that it's happening, things like that. Working on a college newspaper is also, I can see similar things happening. The Daily Californian has been the first to break a number of stories that have later been picked up by bigger newspapers like the SF Chronicle, Berkeley Side, which is another news organization, a professional news organization in Berkeley. And so I think a lot of times people underestimate the power of student journalists just because we're not necessarily considered professional journalists, obviously, in a lot of people's eyes. But I think the work that we do is a reminder that, we also our eyes and ears are out there in the world and we're able to kind of look at these things with a different perspective and how they're affecting students, staff, community members, things like that. I really enjoyed at my high school newspaper how we were able to take a deeper look into these kind of administrative failures and publicize them in a way that would hold administrators accountable or force a response. Because obviously, when you have this article that's coming out and you have people speaking at board meetings, things like that, you can't really shy away from a response. I think, and that was one of the most gratifying things about being a student journalist in high school was seeing people respond to the writing that we wrote or seeing them take an interest into what we were writing about. Um, and so I think student journalists just have a different kind of boots on the ground approach because they're not obviously covering such a wide, city or like state or things like that that a lot of professional news organizations are. So it's really interesting to see the types of things we're able to cover and the level of depth that we're able to kind of go into within them. But I think after going through that experience, my kind of view on how powerful student journalism, especially high school journalism, is changed quite a bit because not only that article, but articles we wrote after that in my junior and senior years were just as powerful in eliciting a community response or broadcasting matters to the community that hadn't been kind of publicized or heard about yet. So yeah, I think that was definitely an eye-opening experience for me to see the kind of power that student journalism does have.
I'm really curious from a personal perspective, how does it feel now to be on the flip side of that conversation and supporting other student journalists? How does as a student journalist yourself, both in high school and in college, now you're supporting other student journalists. How does that feel?
Um, it feels great, honestly. I love it. And especially working with the SPLC, knowing that they gave me so much help and support when I was undergoing it and being able to give back not only to students, but to the organization itself,
Mhm.
with my internship has been really gratifying. And I'm so thankful to have had and continue to have the opportunity to continue working with them. But I love one of my favorite parts about the work that I do is being able to talk to student journalists across the country. I mentioned briefly that I've been writing a lot of blog posts on like hearings and different updates and things like that. And with those, I'm actually able to either call or communicate in some other way with student journalists who are also experiencing censorship in states like Virginia, Nebraska, Missouri. And it's really interesting to me because living in California and as I went to a public high school, we have some of the oldest and the strongest student press protections in the country. We've had a New Voices law for an extremely long time. And it's kind of crazy to me to be talking to these students who don't have a New Voices law in their state and who are still operating under this more detrimental standard to student journalists. But it's been very gratifying to being able to help student journalists across the country publicize their experiences, but also just working with the organization and learning more about like the ins and outs of what they do and the New Voices
Mhm.
movement in
Mhm.
particular.
That's awesome. It's always really exciting when we can give back to our community in something that we have ourselves struggled
Yeah.
with. That's really awesome to hear your story come full circle. I'm also thinking, and I'm not expecting an answer from you on this one, just kind of thinking out loud, is that there are also conversations about journalists who are using new media, and how this all plays into the greater conversation of freedom of the press. And that might be something that we need to revisit as a part of our History Bites program coming up in the future, because I know that there are similar struggles with journalists who don't participate in traditional media formats. So how does that and how does freedom of the press um, pertain to them? So it's really interesting to see how this is all playing out in our country today. Well, I want to thank you again, Myesha, for joining us today. Like I said, I was super, super excited to hear from you and hear about the amazing work that you have been doing at the Student Press Law Center. We have popped the links from your materials into the chat. So folks, if they're interested in learning more, can click on those. And confirmed, of course, that the QR codes as of this watching do work. I'll try to go back and get the QR codes into the description of the
Okay.
program as well, so that folks can access those directly there. But otherwise, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our third and final session on freedom of the press. If you missed either of the last two sessions, you can watch them on our YouTube page at any time. Next month, we are kicking off a two-part mini-series on the freedom of religion. On Wednesday, June 17th, join us to hear Dr. Charles Haynes from the Freedom Forum for the first course. We hope to see you then, and as always,